We'll go ahead and start. Um, my name is Chelsea Nemec, and I am the Director of Catholic School Partnerships here at CLT, and we would just like to welcome everybody for joining and to welcome Dr. Brian Williams to be here with us. Here at CLT, we create meaningful assessments that place before students the true, good, and beautiful. We want to pass down the best that has been thought and said of a great conversation. And we do that through exams, which is always a really fun topic to talk about here at CLT. That sounds strange to hear that exams are fun to talk about, but we have a unique view of what the exam is here at CLT. And it's interesting, the root of the word examination is in Latin, it's the word examine. And I looked up the definitions of this root word, and there were two that came up. The first one was a swarm of bees. And that pretty much explains my experience of exams growing up in public school. But the less painful definition is a tongue of a balance. And this is a pointer. It's a part of a scale that helps to finely measure, give a more fine measurement between the two balances on a scale. And so at CLT, we don't see the exams as the destination of a good education. We see them as a check-in, a fine assessment, a fine measurement of a good education. And we want students, like I said, to experience the true, good, and beautiful. That shouldn't be exempt. If we want our students to experience the transcendentals and all things good of the liberal arts in all of their education, that shouldn't be excluded from exams. So that's the way we look at what we do here. And we offer 3 assessments, as some of you know, the CLT, the CLT-10, and the CLT-8. And we pull from a wide author bank, which is part of why we're here. We're journeying through our author bank. And along with St. John Henry Newman, we have plenty of great thinkers on our author bank. We have Aesop, Aristotle, Jane Austen, Niels Bohr, Euclid, Mendel, Tolkien, and many others. So that's a little bit about who we are at CLT, but I am honored to get to present and introduce a little bit about our guest here today. We're so grateful that Dr. Brian Williams is joining us from the Templeton Honors College. He is the Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities at Templeton, and he is an assistant professor of ethics and liberal studies. Before coming to Eastern, he was a lecturer, and that is Eastern University. Before coming to Eastern, he was a lecturer in theology and Christian ethics at the University of Oxford and director of Oxford Conversations, which was a collection of curated video interviews with leading Christian academics and scholars at Oxford. He holds a master's in philosophy and a doctorate in philosophy and Christian ethics from the University of Oxford, and he was a Clarendon Scholar. He holds a master's, and he holds degrees in systematic and historical theology from Regent College and a bachelor's in biblical studies from Ozark Christian College. His current research examines the tradition of didascalic, did I say that right? Christian humanism, focusing on the works of Hugh of St. Victor, Philip of Malcanthon, and St. John Henry Newman. His broader academic interests include virtue ethics, Christian and Muslim political thought, Karl Barth's theology and politics, classical ed, and Dante. And he is the author of many great books. And so we are so grateful to have him here. As we listen to his presentation, you can put your questions in the chat and also your comments, any comments you might have. And also stick around to the end to get some more information about Templeton. Without further ado, I'd just like to welcome Dr. Brian Williams.
Thank you, Chelsea. Very grateful for that introduction. My mom would have been very pleased to hear you read every single one of those details. Unfortunately, she's not on here. So thanks for that. And like Chelsea said, I'm Dean of the Templeton Honors College and the College of Arts and Humanities at Eastern University. And stick around till the end, and I'll say a little bit more about Templeton, but I put a link in the chat at the very top to our summer program for high school students, which we love to have CLT test takers in our summer program. We got a couple summer programs this summer. One of them is on the moral vision of C.S. Lewis, and one of them is called Coding with the Ancients, where we learn actual coding and use of Raspberry Pi and robots, but then we also have times to think about the ethics of technology and artificial intelligence and those kinds of things. So check out that link. But tonight we're doing a deep dive into John Henry Newman, and I'm going to take that title seriously, a deep dive. I'll give you a brief overview of Newman, and then we're going to do a deep dive into a specific aspect of Newman's thought. So I'm going to share my screen for a little bit. It gives you something else to look at besides me, and then we'll take it away here. So let me make a little technology work here. All right. John Henry Newman lived 1801 to 1890. He was an educator, author, theologian, churchman, poet, and novelist, and his life spanned almost the entire 19th century. His work and his writing directly impacted and influenced a whole host of influential writers and authors, some of whose names you might know. Let me list a few of those. Gerard Manley Hopkins, Henry James, J.R.R. Tolkien, James Joyce, Michael Polanyi, Pierre Hadot, Bernard Lonergan, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Yaroslav Pelikan, Alistair McIntyre, Pope John Paul II, and Pope Benedict, among many others. There are also hundreds of Newman societies on college campuses all across the world that nurture students in the intellectual and spiritual formation that really that Newman modeled in his own life. Now, as an educator and an Oxford man myself, like Newman, I've been influenced in multiple ways by Newman, some of which I probably can identify, and some of the ways I probably can't. Now, one of the central categories that informed the way Newman thought about both theoretical and practical questions related to truth and questions related to ethics or morality, and that informed the way he lived as a churchman and an educator, was the category of the personal, a person's immediate experience of God, a person's own process of thinking and reasoning, the influence of one person on another, the discernment of an individual person's conscience, and because of that, the need to develop one's own intellectual and moral prudence. So there are dozens of ways that we could dive deep into Newman. And if you know Newman well, you might think, why didn't he talk about that? Why didn't he talk about that? Well, because there's so many things to talk about with Newman. But I'm going to take this category of the personal and try to give us a little window into the way that Newman thought about this and the way it informed some of his broader interests. First, though, let me say a word about Newman as educator, as student of the classics, and as a churchman. So first, Newman says that from first to last, education has been my line. Newman was educated himself at a private boarding school before he entered the University of Oxford. Get this, at age 16, he entered into Trinity College in Oxford, where he studied classics and mathematics. Very promising student. But let me tell you a little story about Newman that might encourage some of you before you take your first CLT exam. So Newman, when he went to take his final exams at Oxford in 1820, and his whole degree rested on these exams. They lasted multiple days, and how well he did on these exams, his whole degree and whether he graduated depended on them. Now, 1820, he goes to take his exams, and on those exams, he completely bombed them. He was exhausted, he was overworked, and he wrote later that he lost his head and utterly broke down. On these final exams, get this, Newman failed his mathematics exam entirely and got the lowest possible passable score on his classics exam. So not a great beginning to a career as an academic or an author. However, you might take courage if this happens to you. 2 years later, in 1822, he goes back, this time to Oriel College, Oxford, and he sits for an exam that could qualify him to become a fellow, a teaching fellow at Oriel, which is one of the leading academic colleges at Oxford. Lo and behold, even though in 1820 he fails all of exams, in 1822 he does so well that they elect him a fellow and later tutor at Oriel, where he becomes a much beloved teacher by his students, in part because he was really primarily interested in their personal and their holistic formation. So if you bomb the CLT exam or you bomb your final exams, it doesn't have to be the end of your life as a student or a learner, or actually even as an academic. Most of us in academics have had moments very similar to Newman's there. Now, a little bit more on Newman, the educator, before we move on. So after he left Oriel and Oxford after many years, he went on to be involved in the founding of the Catholic University of Dublin, and later in his life, the all-boys oratory school in Birmingham. So Newman rarely was outside the orbit of the school or university. As he aged, he loved being involved in the oratory school with these kind of grade school and junior high aged boys. And he said that was the nearest return to my Oxford life, because the school combined not only instruction in the classroom, but also the kind of informal community life. Boys who lived together with their teachers, and teachers who cared about the emotional and physical and intellectual and spiritual well-being of their students. Now, so Newman, not only was he involved in education, he wrote about education in several different works. He wrote a very large volume, which contains 2 works on the university, usually published as The Idea of a University. He also wrote a whole series of essays that were published in a volume called The Rise and Progress of Universities. He wrote a very sophisticated book then on epistemology, or how we know what's true, and we'll get into that later. So Newman, when he says first to last, education has been my line, that really is played out in how he lived and what he wrote. Now, but Newman was also a student of the classics. He studied classics, like I mentioned, at Oxford, so Greek and Latin languages and literature, and was especially indebted to Aristotle throughout his life. And he thinks in many respects like an Aristotelian. I have a great affinity for Aristotle and teach him myself, so that might be one reason why I really resonate with Newman. But we know that Newman, maybe like some of you all, he studied the Nicomachean ethics, he studied the rhetoric, he studied the poetics as an undergraduate. He wrote a detailed analysis of the rhetoric, later taught it. His copy of the ethics has notes scribbled out throughout the whole thing. And he later wrote an article on the poetics and co-authored a book on logic, largely based on Aristotle's thought. A couple of the quotes that I have on the screen here. The top one is from one of his sermons. He says, "The boldest, simplest, and most comprehensive theory which has been invented for the analysis of the reasoning process is the well-known science for which we are indebted to Aristotle." In his book on epistemology called The Grammar of Ascent, he writes, "As to the intellectual position from which I have contemplated the subject, Aristotle has been my master." In The Rise and Progress of Universities, he describes Aristotle as the most comprehensive intellect of antiquity. And in The Idea of a University, he writes that last bit. He says, "While the world lasts, will Aristotle's doctrine on these matters of thinking and education last? For he is the oracle of nature and of truth. While we are men, we cannot help to a great extent being Aristotelians." It's quite the line. And he goes on, kind of a mini encomium to Aristotle. Now, Newman was also a master rhetorician and writer. And though Aristotle was his teacher regarding knowledge and logic and education, he says that Cicero was the only master of style I have ever had. Now, Newman himself was really quite in his day, quite an impressive writer and stylist. So no less than James Joyce, a well-known Irish writer, wrote this. He said, "Nobody has ever written English prose that can be compared with Newman." Gerard Manley Hopkins, the great English poet himself, called Newman our greatest living master of style and the widest mind we have. Pretty high praise from folks like James Joyce and John Henry and Gerard Manley Hopkins. Now, Hopkins was a friend, and Hopkins offered twice to Newman to write a commentary on his big book, An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Ascent. Unfortunately for us, Newman turned him down. I say unfortunately because I would have loved to have heard Hopkins on Newman, but maybe fortunately because that probably left more time for Hopkins to write the poetry that so many of us love. Now, though he was influenced by Aristotle, influenced by Cicero, when it came time to choose an epitaph for his memorial stone, Newman chooses a Latin phrase that echoes Plato's cave analogy from the Republic. And you see it there, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, meaning out of the shadows and images into the truth. It's the idea of shadowlands was something that C.S. Lewis also picked up from Plato. And here, Newman, of course, meant into the truth, not of the good, but of Christ and the triune God. Newman also wrote a really interesting long epic poem called The Dream of Gerontius, which is modeled on Dante's comedy. So all kinds of ways in which our man Newman was informed and influenced by the classical tradition that we love with the classic learning test. Now, one final piece on Newman. Not only was he an educator, not only was he a classicist, but very much a churchman. I don't know what else to call him. When he was at Oriel College in 1824, he was ordained a deacon and later became a curate at a church in Oxford called St. Clement's in the city's poorest parish. The church he worked in is no longer there because while Newman was there, he helped raise money to build a new church just around the corner. And it's one where I've worshiped several times because when I used to live in Oxford, it was just down the road from our house. Newman eventually became an Anglican priest and vicar of the university's church. The University of Oxford has a church called the University Church of St. Mary's. He then became a leader in what was known as the Tractarian or the Oxford movement, which really tried to foster a personal renewal of people and a spiritual revival within the Anglican Church by returning the Anglican Church to pre-Reformation ways of worshiping and devotion. So that tradition is carried on in Oxford at a great place called Pusey House, where a good friend of mine is the principal, and it gave us what sometimes is called the Anglo-Catholic tradition within the Anglican Church. Later, though, through his study of the church fathers and the development of church doctrine and the history of the Anglican Church, Newman felt himself drawn into the Catholic Church. And on October 9th, 1845, on a rainy, blustery evening, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church at a little place called Littlemore, again, in one of the other poorest parts of Oxford where Newman had built a little chapel and school. After that, Newman becomes a Catholic priest, founder of the Birmingham Oratory, which is also where Gerard Manley Hopkins became a Catholic, and where a very young J.R.R. Tolkien lived for many years. In fact, Tolkien's experience at the Birmingham Oratory was so influential that he named his first child after one of the priests at Newman's oratory. Later, near the end of his life, Newman, as you see on the picture, he was elevated to the rank of cardinal by Pope Leo XIII. And in 2019, he was beatified and officially recognized as a saint of the Catholic Church. So a little bit of overview there of Newman, the educator, Newman, the student of the classics, and Newman, the churchman. Now, here's where we're going to do the deep dive. All right, so get on your scuba gear because we're going to go deep here with Newman and into Newman's epistemology, his understanding of the nature of knowledge and truth. But we're going to get into that through this window of the category of the personal, because Newman was interested in not only personal devotion, but personal reasoning and personal formation through relationships with other persons. Okay, so though he taught logic and wrote a logic textbook, like I said, he recognized that most people most of the time, and maybe even all people, all of the time, don't actually think in terms of formal logic and syllogisms. Now, maybe apologies to those of you out there who teach logic, but what Newman is trying to do is he's trying to give us a way of thinking about how we actually go about reasoning. He says most of the time, people arrive at and commit themselves to conclusions without the use of formal logic. In the background here is not only his desire to explain how we reason, but also René Descartes' charge that we can be certain that we know something only when we cannot doubt it, and that we should avoid believing things that are not entirely certain, like many religious beliefs. Newman just doesn't find Descartes necessary or convincing. So he wants to create space, especially for religious beliefs and commitments, but also for any kind of reasoning or commitment outside of Descartes' version of certainty. So Newman draws on, no surprise, Aristotle. He draws on Aristotle's concept of phronesis. Now, if you know what that means, if you know Aristotle, you know that phronesis is usually translated practical reason or prudence. But Newman finds that a really useful category, not only for thinking about our virtuous moral reasoning, but also for virtuous theoretical or intellectual reasoning. So usually practical reason starts with basic moral principles, right? Like very generally, do good, avoid evil. Then it teaches us to attend to the morally relevant particulars of any given situation. And then we ask ourselves, oh, in this situation with these principles, how would a virtuous person act? And then we go on to try to discern some virtuous moral way of acting. Well, Newman's innovation is that he doesn't limit it to moral action, but extends it to theoretical and intellectual actions that end in belief and commitment. So we're going to go through a little bit, some of his ideas in this book, An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Ascent. Now, he calls it a grammar. So he's operating here in the grammatical mode of trying to name things. And he gives us several categories that I've got on the screen there. He says there's this thing called inference, and there are three types of inference: formal inference, informal inference, and natural inference. Then he's got this thing called the Illiterative Sense, which is his kind of idiosyncratic name for virtuous intellectual reasoning. Illative comes from the passive of the Latin verb inferre, to be to infer or to be carried, illatus, hence the illative sense. And then he's got this category of assent, and he says there are two kinds of assent: notional and real. So let me walk you through grammatically some of these terms and see how Newman uses them. So inference, right? Okay, so inference comes from the Latin inferre, meaning to lift or to bring into. So an inference is an acceptance of or a commitment to some belief that our intellect has carried us to. So formal inference for Newman is illustrated by syllogisms, symbolic logic, and mathematics. He says this is great when we have it. It's simple, it's clear, but he doesn't find it terribly interesting because he doesn't think, as I've said, that most people most of the time rely on formal or syllogistic inference for what they believe. More likely, he says, we arrived at what we believe through informal inference. And I think this is really fascinating to me. He says, this is when we believe something to be true as the result of multiple independent but individually inconclusive strands of probabilities. Okay, so go with me. He says formal inference is like an iron rod, but informal inference is like a number of separate threads, each of which might be feeble, but yet together are as strong as the iron rod. So if you think of like coiled steel that holds up a suspension bridge, those massive cables that hold up like the Brooklyn Bridge, if you've ever been there, individually, no one of those little cables could hold much of anything. but altogether they are as strong as, he thinks, syllogistic logic and formal inference. So, for example, if I claim that my children love me, I can't necessarily produce a formal syllogism, but I can probably produce a series of reasons that together make the inference probable. If I believe in the existence of the Trinity, or the goodness of beauty, or the justifiable use of force in some situations, I probably arrived at those conclusions as a result of multiple individual strands of evidence that are all wound up together. So if you think of your religious beliefs, whatever they are, ask yourself, what carried me to those beliefs? What role do all my collateral, intellectual, and relational commitments play? For instance, how is what my family believes bound up in that, and my upbringing, and my lived experience, and what I believe about other things, and what other smart and moral people might believe about those things, or what I think might be in the biblical testimony or in philosophy. All of these get bound up into informal inference that usually lead us to the kind of settled religious, philosophical, significant beliefs that we have. So it's a really fascinating category that Newman gives us, where he's trying to describe how we actually think and reason. Now, here's where I think this is really sometimes very useful. Sometimes we find ourselves wondering, how on earth did this other person arrive at this conclusion, which is so significantly different from my own, right? How on earth did you get to that conclusion? I don't see it. Newman helps us see that we might be able to understand how that other person got there if we could see the various individual strands of data, experience, arguments, and what I'm calling collateral, intellectual, and relational commitments that were all wound together that carried that person to that conclusion. But Newman says lots of times our own reasoning is unclear to us, and it's probably unclear to the other person. So we can't always see how another person got to that conclusion, but we can recognize that, we might operate with some of the same individual strands of reasoning, but you might weight different strands differently than I do. You might think some are more significant than I do, so that we find ourselves arriving at two different conclusions, even though neither one of us was irrational, that we can both be reasonable and arrive at different conclusions. Now, we might both be wrong. That is true. But at least we can try to understand how we actually arrived at those conclusions and how another person did as well. If nothing else, Newman says, this ought to induce in us some intellectual humility about our own reasoning and about our judgments about the conclusions that other people arrived at. Okay, so that's formal and informal inference. Now, another one that he describes is natural inference. This one is also really interesting to me. He says that this is how lots of times we reason through what he calls natural inference. And he says this is moving from wholes to whole, not like a hole, but like WHOLE. He says lots of times we come to conclusions about things very quickly without even realizing that we are processing. This is like when we say, this seems right to me, or this seems the right thing to do. It's kind of a gut feeling. So, for instance, if you walk into a room and you ask yourself, who's the friendliest person here? You might immediately come to a conclusion about a certain person in the room, but not really know why, right? It's the same way like a poet finds the right word at the end of a poem. Or if you're walking down a sidewalk and somebody's walking towards you, you immediately sense like how you should react in that situation. Should you run? Should you say hello? Should you shake their hand? He says this is natural inference, and we just immediately arrive at a conclusion. Now, if you're any of your Sherlock Holmes fans, this is what Sherlock is doing all the time. And if you're fans of the BBC series Sherlock, in one of the episodes called The Six Thatchers, Sherlock does this the entire show. And it's described multiple times in the show without actually being named with Newman's category. But Watson refers to what he's doing several times. And what he describes is moving from an immediate survey of a scene to a conclusion. Now, Newman also suggests that this natural inference is somewhat or can be discipline specific. Now, here's what he means by that. He says, a historian can develop a kind of natural inference as a historian, or a general in the army as a general, or a poet, or a theologian, or a physicist, who might not have any understanding of other fields of knowledge, but they can develop a natural, a kind of excellent natural inference within their own field, right? When, again, the poet discerns just the right word, or an athlete knows just the right move, or a farmer can read the weather, or a psychologist can instantly read a person. He says that comes when we spend significant amounts of time and practice within a specific domain or kind of field of knowledge. And this leads Newman to, excuse me, I skipped a slide there. Okay, there we go. Inference, formal, informal, and natural. But he follows Aristotle here with a great quote about why we should heed the words and the insights of people who have developed natural inference, as, if you will, experts or people of significant experience and possibly significant age. Here's what he writes. And, this is relevant to students of any age. He says, to use the grand words of Aristotle, we are bound to give heed to the undemonstrated sayings and opinions of the experienced and aged, not less than to their formal demonstrations, because from their having the eye of experience, they behold the principles of things. Instead of trusting only logical science, we must trust persons, namely those who by long acquaintance with their subject have a right to judge. If we wish ourselves to share in their convictions and the grounds of them, we must follow their history and learn as they have learned. We must take up their particular subject as they took it up, beginning at the beginning, give ourselves to it, and depend on practice and experience more than on reasoning, and thus gain their mental insight into truth, whatever its subject may be, by which our masters have gained before us. By following this course, we make ourselves of their number, directing ourselves by our own moral or intellectual judgment. So a lot of these themes come together there, the importance of the personal, attending to the accumulated wisdom and virtuous natural inference of people long practiced in a particular discipline, and then in a way, apprenticing ourselves to them so that we can develop our own personal moral and intellectual judgment and the excellent performance of our own natural inference. Here you see Newman, the educator, as well. Now, these three forms of inference are followed by what he called the Illiterative Sense. Now, the Illiterative Sense is what moves us from a conditional or preliminary acceptance of an idea to a kind of settled conviction. This is unique to Newman. So comparable to Aristotle's moral prudence, or the activity of Aristotle's virtuous person, which he called the phronemoi, Newman has this concept of the virtuous intellectual reasoning. So Aristotle, for instance, says, okay, if you're in a situation and you don't know how to act, one of the things you can ask yourself is, how would a morally virtuous person act in this situation? Newman says you can do the same thing intellectually. And the question would be, how would an intellectually virtuous person think or reason in this case? This would be somebody who has a virtuous illiterative sense, or an excellent theoretical reason. So I don't know who the morally virtuous person is that you know that you would think about to say, maybe it's your mom or your grandmother. But who would that be intellectually? For me, it's a couple of my teachers. Sometimes I think, okay, what would J.I. Packer, one of my teachers and mentors and bosses for a while, what would J.I. Packer think of this? Or my doctoral supervisor, Nigel Bigger, how would Nigel reason through this? Because I think both of them are exemplars of people with a virtuous illiterative sense. Newman says that's what we're talking about here. And the illiterative sense and virtuous intellectual reasoning comparable to virtuous practical reasoning. He compares it to an excellent rock climber, kind of feeling their way up a cliff, not having rules and not having directions about where to put their hands, but just having a kind of intuitive, practiced sense of how to climb the rock wall as they reach for a ledge, or if you might say, a reach for some intellectual conclusion. Now, all right, so we've got natural, formal, and informal inference for Newman, all trying to describe how we reason as persons. Then we've got the illiterative sense, the virtuous intellectual reasoning that moves us to commitment. Now, finally, he's got this really fascinating distinction between what he calls notional assent and real assent. And this is applicable not only to students, but also to teachers. Now, let me unpack these. He says, even when the illiterative sense moves a person to assent, that assent can be notional or real. Now, notional assent describes the relatively detached acceptance of an abstract concept or idea, whereas real apprehension and assent describes a kind of embodied, affective, personal conviction and commitment. Real apprehension and assent, Newman thinks, is more likely to lead to personal commitment, character formation, and action than instances of simply notional apprehension and assent. It's not that notional assent is shallow, it's just that it doesn't involve much of me personally. It doesn't involve me physically, emotionally, or spiritually. It doesn't move anything other than just my intellect. So, for instance, I might have a notional assent to the common humanity of each person, but not act on it. I might have a notional assent to the proposition that war is a tragic event, or that God exists, or that the conclusions of Scripture are true, or a notional assent that caring for the poor is important, or that I should exercise, or that reading classic authors is worth my time. Right? I might have a notional assent to those things, but then not do anything with or feel anything about those truths. On the other hand, there's real assent. It's the difference here between, again, abstractly accepting the idea that war is tragic and reading a firsthand account of the horror of the Battle of the Somme, or hearing soldiers describe the aftermath of PTSD, or visiting Commonwealth graves across France, or visiting in Ypres, Belgium, the Menin Gate, which has inscribed on it 55,000 names of British soldiers, not simply who died, but who died and whose bodies were never recovered. And where every single night since 1928, a bugler plays taps to call those soldiers home. I just got chills even recounting that story. And I've seen that. And when you have those kinds of experiences, Newman thinks you are moving closer to real assent, because it engages not only your mind, but also your affections and possibly your commitments and your actions. For me, something like this happened with my understanding of the Christian church. Growing up in a kind of single denomination, I thought, well, this is the way you're supposed to do church and everybody else is suspect. Until two things happened. One, I read Charles Williams' Descent of the Dove, and then I started visiting churches. And I worshiped in Roman Catholic churches and Anglican churches and Orthodox churches. And I realized, oh, we're all reading the same Bible. We're all praying and trying to love one another. And that embodied experience led me to a kind of real assent to a notion to a truth that I only had notional assent to earlier, which was that the church was much wider and larger than I had known. So for Newman, the educator, he wants his students, and he thinks, he wants his students to move towards real ascent, so that it results in some sort of commitment and character formation and action. Now, Newman's treatment of practical and intellectual prudence manifests itself in different ways across his work. So, as I've already been describing, when he's thinking about epistemology and the nature of truth, he describes prudence as this illiterative sense. When he thinks about it in his work on education, he describes it as intellectual judgment. When he thinks about it in the context of the church, he describes it as the sense of the faithful, or the kind of settled conviction of the laity in the pew. When he thinks about church history, he thinks about prudence in terms of church tradition. And he says, this is what church tradition is. It's the phronesis, or the kind of settled prudence of the church extended through space and time. When he thinks about it into the ethical realm, he calls it the conscience, or the moral sense. You see, in all of these categories, Newman is focused on the person, the personal, the real lived experience of how we think and act. It means for him that you can't surrender your thinking or your acting to someone else, whether it's a professor, or even for Newman, the Pope or the president, because he says, even when they tell me something, I listen to it, I learn from it, but I'm the one that still has to think and decide on my own. Now, let me shift a little bit from epistemology to education and trace this out. So, in the realm of education, the importance of the personal implies that the student, like I've just been saying, has to learn to think and reason on their own and not wait passively for the teacher to do something to them. Some of my students think that education is something that I do to them when they sit rather passively in my class, and they kind of stumble in and they say, all right, do it to me. Newman says, no, you've got the wrong idea. What education and learning are the individual person trying to develop this virtuous intellectual reasoning leading to real ascent. So Newman, if you know anything about Newman, you might know his work on education. He critiques several models of education that he doesn't think sufficiently form students to think on their own intellectually. He critiques some models that just pursue education as job training, some that just run students through a whole series of courses without ever teaching them or modeling for them how to integrate and embody their knowledge. Now, these kinds of models and approaches to education, he's got a couple great analogies. He said, one way to think about what much modern education does for us, he said it's like you take a box and you fill it with jigsaw puzzle pieces. And he says that box is the student's head. And some of our schools just dump puzzle pieces into students' head and then put the lid on top of the box and never help the students see how all those pieces fit together into a coherent whole. Another analogy, he says, much of modern education is like only showing somebody the backside of a beautiful tapestry, where they only see the tattered colored bits and never walking them around to see how all those colors are integrated into a beautiful whole. He says what this does, it results in distracting and enfeebling the student by this whole unmeaning profusion of subjects. And I love this, of implying that a smattering in a dozen branches of study is not shallowness, which it really is, but enlargement of the mind, he says, which it is not. He says this leaves most students so shallow they don't even know their own shallowness. Now, here we see the personal at work again, because Newman argues that in order to acquire knowledge and information and experience, each one of us needs to build what he calls like flexible mental maps that coordinate and relate all the principles and all the particular bits of knowledge and understanding we have acquired, and so that we can then take our map and see how things are integrated, but also see how that map compares to the concrete world outside of our own head. He says that we know by piecemeal and accumulation, by a mental process, by going around an object, and by the comparison, the combination, the correction, the adaptation of all these partial notions that we have. For Newman, this is the model of education that we ought to pursue. He says this is what acquiring wisdom, or as he calls it, the enlargement of the mind, consists of, when we don't have all these just chunks of knowledge and bits of puzzle pieces in our head, but try to see how they fit together. How he, in his words, we pursue a connected view of the old with the new, an insight into the bearing and influence of each part upon the other. And as he says in this quote from The Idea of a University, it is the power of referring everything to its true place in the universal system, of comprehending the exact value of each. It never views any part of the extended subject matter of knowledge without recollecting that it is but a part, or without the associations which spring from this recollection. It communicates the image of the whole body to every separate member. Now, Newman thinks that not only do we as learners have to do this, but every school ought to be doing this, that schools ought to help their students see how each one of the disciplines, each one of the classes, each one of the spheres of knowledge that we pursue relate to all the others, and that we ought to see this embodied in those persons who make up the heart of the school, which are the teachers. So for Newman, one question might be, how do I develop this virtuous illiterative sense? How do I develop what he calls a philosophical habit of mind, which sees how all of these parts and how all of these bits of data in my mind are connected? Well, for Newman, this is the final piece I want to tease out here. For Newman, this happens when students and when any of us who are learners are deeply immersed in what he thinks of as formative learning communities, and especially in relationships with teachers. So for Newman, the classroom and the lecture are fine, and they have their place. And they're really geared towards transmitting knowledge and advancing knowledge. But for Newman, in order to cultivate one's philosophical habit of mind, or moral virtue, or spiritual maturity, we have to look outside of the classroom. For Newman, in his context, that meant looking into the small colleges where students lived and met regularly, both formally and informally, with their teachers. In these colleges, they would share a common life. And he says, in sharing a common life, our moral and our spiritual and intellectual understanding are more likely to move from notional assent to embodied real assent. He says these are like households in which involve the same patterns of discipline and common life and exchange that we might find in one's own home. He reflects on this a lot, about the importance of living together, of these personal relationships. And this is why for Newman, everywhere he went, he tried to foster these kinds of embodied learning communities. So whether he was at Oxford or in Littlemore or in Birmingham or Dublin, and in some ways, they're similar to some of our schools when we have multiple points of contact with teachers who come to inform the way we think, come to inform the way we act, come to inform what we know. And for Newman, he thinks this is really important for teachers, and so he addresses in his world the college tutor, but to be applicable to any teacher. He says it's really important that tutors take an interest in the things which are at the moment nearest to the student's heart, as they enter into conversation, speculation, discussion during their intercourse of mind with mind. In this way, Newman writes, obscurity of thought Difficulties in philosophy, perplexities of faith are confidently brought out, sifted and solved, and a pagan poet or theorist may become the occasion of moral, spiritual, and intellectual formation. Now, what you can see on the screen here, you can see Newman's own motto, cor ad cor loquitur, which means, some of you will know, heart speaks to heart. This was the motto of the oratory school, and this is engraved in a window in the Newman Chapel at Oriel College. So this is the ideal for Newman, the heart of the teacher speaking to the heart of the student, responding back to the heart of the teacher. He says this is where we find in this relationship the deep intellectual personal formation that he reflects on in his book on epistemology. This also happens when the teacher embodies what Newman really lovingly calls rhetoric in conduct. When the teacher is able to offer their own lives and their own way of thinking and being as part of the student's curriculum. The idea being that if you want to know how a poet thinks, hang out with a poet. You want to know how a mathematician thinks, hang out with a mathematician. You want to know how a virtuous person thinks and acts, spend time around a virtuous person to see what they do. It's kind of like when the Apostle Paul tells Timothy, follow me as I follow Christ. It's similar to that earlier quote where he says we got to follow the words and thinking of the aged and the experienced, as heart speaks to heart. Now, let me give you a long passage here that really gets at this, and I think gets at the heart of Newman's understanding of education and learning and the personal embodied nature of intellectual formation. Here's what he writes. This is one of my favorite passages on Newman. And he's writing this in the context of cheap books that have come out and the claim that, oh, I don't need to go to school. I just need to read books. I don't know what you would think about our internet age. But here's what Newman writes. He says, we should note that when students aim at something precise, something refined, something really luminous, something really large, something choice, they avail themselves of oral instruction, of present communication between man and man, of teachers instead of learning, of the personal influence of a master and the humble initiation of a disciple. If we wish, he writes, to become exact and fully furnished in any branch of knowledge which is diversified and complicated, we must consult the living man and listen to his living voice. No book can convey the special spirit and delicate peculiarities of its subject with that rapidity and certainty which attend on the sympathy of mind with mind, through the eyes, the look, the accent, and the manner, in casual expressions thrown off at the moment, and the unstudied turn of familiar conversation. I love this. The general principles of any study you may learn by books at home, but the detail, the color, the tone, the air, the life which makes it lives in us, you must catch all those from those in whom it lives already. We must come to the teachers of wisdom to learn wisdom. We must repair to the fountain ad fontes and drink there. Portions of it may go thence to the ends of the earth by means of books, but the fullness is in one place alone. A lovely, lovely description of what teachers do for us. I mean, almost all of us who are teachers had this kind of experience with some teacher in our own life. But note how he uses the great Renaissance phrase, to the sources, or ad fontes. Usually that means returning to the sources, meaning the primary books, books of, if you will, of disembodied wisdom. But when Newman references ad fontes here, he doesn't reference the books. He taught all these books, but he references teachers as the primary sources in which students will find embodied wisdom. Because teachers can be models of integrated intellectual, aesthetic, moral, and spiritual personal formation. models of the virtuous illiterative sense or real assent, or models of the philosophical habit of mind, models of people who live well before God and with their neighbors in their own ways. This is a kind of personal, incarnate pedagogy that offers the teacher's life as part of the curriculum, as one of these, as a rhetoric in conduct, as he describes. This beautiful vision is a model and an inspiration for many of us, even if, like Newman himself, we never fully live up to the ideal. So let me wrap up there our deep dive, and we'll start swimming back up to the surface. But what I've tried to give you here is a deep dive into Newman the educator, Newman the student of the classics, Newman the churchman, who drew on the classical tradition to help us consider, among other things, the irreducibly personal nature of learning, thinking, and the intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation of the human person and all our own particularity. Now, finally, if you want to go deeper into Newman, there's some of his big books. There's The Idea of a University, which are reflections he gave when they were founding the Catholic University of Dublin. There's his book on epistemology, which is a remarkable piece of work called An Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Ascent. There's a collection of sermons that he preached at the University of Oxford that you can find. If you're interested in a biography, the best biography is one by Ian Carr, last name spelled K-E-R. Ian is a wonderful human being. He's a priest in a little village outside Oxford called Burford. I was very privileged to be able to study Newman with him many years ago. But his book, just called John Henry Newman, A Biography, is the best place to go for an overview of Newman's life. So let me wrap it there. And Chelsea, I will stop sharing my screen, and we can take some questions, and I can share a little bit more about the Templeton Honors College and some of our summer programs for high school students, where I will say one of the reasons I left Oxford and came to the Honors College here at Eastern University, because what I saw the Honors College doing, I saw it reflecting what Newman talks about. A small community of learning and worshiping that attends to the deep intellectual, moral, spiritual, and aesthetic formation of its students. And so Newman so influenced me that I wanted to be part of a community like that. And it's, I found it in the Templeton Honors College, partially, of course, but everywhere that you see this embodied is going to be a partial embodiment of the ideal. I guess in that way, I'm Platonic, not solely Aristotelian. So let me stop sharing my screen if I can, and we can take some questions or comments, or happy to clarify anything that I stumbled my way through there.
Wow, Dr. Williams, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. When you brought up Cor ad cor loquitur, it reminded me of where Amy's teaching at Sacred Heart in Grand Rapids. That is their motto as well. So
lovely.
there are people in the audience that know deeply about what you're talking about, which is wonderful.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So David Crowder asks, do you recommend Loss and Gain?
David Crowder, is this a book by Newman that I don't know, or is this a title? Maybe it's a Newman's stuff gets repackaged and republished with different under different names, which often happens. And so I honestly, off the top of my head, don't know Loss and Gain.
Well, David can clarify. I'll go to another question while if he wants to type back in the chat and give us an author. But Hope asked a question. She said, Aristotle and Plato were pagan. Why are they always referred to as pillars to build from? Weren't there Jewish sages or writers to build upon for developing great thought for Christian academics? Was it because of how they taught?
Yeah, this is a great question. Aristotle and Plato obviously were pagan. They were pre-Christians. But, the history of what we think of as the Christian liberal arts tradition or Christian classical education is really the tradition. It's the reception history of the Greek and Roman authors and thinkers. And so when you get to even early church, North Africa, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Gregory of Nazianzus over in Asia Minor, Basil of Caesarea, they all grapple with this question in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. St. Augustine does too. And their explanation of this is that, well, just because Plato and Aristotle were not Christians doesn't mean they didn't have access to certain true things. They're humans, they're created in the image of God. And for most of those early authors, Basil and Clement, they see the pagan authors as receiving what's sometimes called natural revelation or general revelation, that God actually used those pagan authors to bring certain truths to the surface for us that didn't belong to them as pagans. I mean, if things were true, they were true and they belonged to God. And so when the Christian authors read them, they say, well, given the more fulsome understanding of the truth that we have, we're able to see certain places in Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Isocrates that look to be fully true and coherent with what we know from Christian teaching. In fact, someone like Philip Melanchthon, who was Martin Luther's right-hand man and one of the magisterial reformers, he says Jesus didn't need to reveal to us how to cultivate virtue in the Bible because God had already revealed that through Aristotle. It's a really fascinating claim. And, you know, Melanchthon says the same thing when it comes to running a political government. He said God didn't reveal to that in Scripture because we already had some of that in Cicero. Now, Clement and Basil will say, they have lots of analogies, but they say it's a little bit like picking a beautiful flower from a rose bush. That rose bush has thorns on it. And so we have to be careful of the thorns when we go to pick some of these pagan flowers, but that doesn't mean we don't have to acknowledge that they are beautiful flowers. He just says we have to be careful. And he says, he compares this, Basil has a great analogy where he compares this to honeybees. And he says honeybees don't go to every flower, but when they go to a flower, they avoid the thorns, they draw out the nectar from that flower, and then they take it back and they make honey with it. And his analogy is that that's what those of us in the classical tradition, that's what Newman is doing with Aristotle, that's what Augustine is doing with Plato, that's what Hugh of St. Victor is doing with everybody that came before him, that we're like those honeybees drawing what's good out of pagan flowers in order to make beautiful honey, if you will. So that's a great question. And the church has kind of come back around to this all kinds of times. But I think that's how I would say that there are certain truths in these authors that we can benefit from, and that we ought not ignore them simply because, if you will, they lived before Christ. Just final point on your Jewish comment. Yeah, absolutely. And the early church was almost entirely Jewish at the very beginning. But then those early educators, yes, you know, they draw on both the Old Testament and the New Testament. But then they also draw from the wisdom from the Greeks and Romans to say, yeah, there is this, and behind it, they see God's hand behind all of that, I think. So that's how I would explain that.
Dr. Williams, do you think that, I've read a little of Newman's The Idea of a University, and it seems like he's saying that the liberal arts and Greek and Roman society is almost like the soil from which Christianity has grown. And it's not the same thing as the plant, but it is part of its cultivation.
Yeah, and that's right. And you look at somebody like the Apostle Paul. I mean, the Apostle Paul seems to have been steeped in Greek thought. He knew his Greek philosophy. We see the Apostle Paul quoting Greek poets. You know, I mean, he was able to dialogue in Athens with Greek philosophers on their own terms. And so, in a way, you know, one way to think about it as well, and this has been a kind of common way to say that it was proto-evangelion. It was pre-good news, or the pre-evangelistic work that gave us categories, that gave us certain ways of thinking that then the church found useful for communicating. You know, among other things, just the Greek language as the language that kind of everybody knew at the time. So, in God's providential care over the course of history, I think there's a case to be made there to say, yeah, we can benefit from some of the insights and wisdom of the pagans. Now, there's always, like Augustine says, the Platonists, what does he say? Wore the actors' high boots of a supposedly more sublime philosophy, and they were able to see the mountaintop, but not take me there. So Augustine recognizes they could see moral virtue, but they couldn't help Augustine become virtuous. For that, he needed to repent, and he needed the indwelling of the Spirit. And so that's how Newman struggles with this. If you read kind of books 7 and 8 of the Confessions, but he sees that he was being led towards his conversion as he moved his way through certain Greek and Roman philosophers. So,
yes, very good. Skylar asks, is there one work of Newman's that you would especially recommend? And which work of Newman's is best to start with for someone who has never read anything by him?
Yeah, here it's what you're interested in. So what you're interested in, my answer would depend on what you're interested in. So I would say if you're interested in Newman, the theologian, I would find either a collection of his sermons. Sometimes that's the best way to start with Newman. Find a nice collection of Newman's sermons and read those, and you start to get the person of Newman as he spoke to his parishioners. If you're interested in Newman's understanding of church history, he's got a book on the development of Christian doctrine, which is really fascinating. And there we get a lot of Newman reflecting on tradition. And that's the book that really influenced, if you know these authors, Alistair MacIntyre and Yaroslav Pelikan and Joseph Pieper, on their work on tradition. All three of those significant 20th century authors point back and say, I learned everything I know about tradition, more or less, to Newman's book on the development of Christian doctrine. If you're interested in Newman on education, the place to start is his book, The Idea of a University. And you can find it in several different editions. And if you're interested, if you have a philosophical bent, you might be interested in his essay In Aid of a Grammar of Ascent, but it's pretty heady stuff. And that's some of what I drew on for tonight. But maybe with that kind of framing I gave you, those of you who are more philosophically oriented might be keen on that. So I think that's what I would say, Skylar.
Wonderful. So maybe we can hear a little bit about Templeton Honors College.
Sure. Just a word about Templeton Honors College, because that's where I'm the dean. And like I said, I left the University of Oxford where I was in order to come to Templeton because it looked like one model, one instantiation of the kind of thing that Newman was talking about. So in the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University, we have 3 programs, and let me tell you about all 3 of those. One is a high school, is a program for high school students, which many of you might be, called the Summer Scholars Program. This is a program that takes place in the summer where students come to our campus for 8 or 9 days. They take courses in a small community with other students from around the country. They take courses with our faculty members, and we have our upperclassmen in the Honors College serving as teaching assistants. You can get college credit for these classes, and we have them on topics like the moral vision of C.S. Lewis, the Christian fantasy literature of J.R.R. Tolkien. I always lead 3 sessions in that on Dante's Comedy, because what we're looking at with both of those courses are the authors from the classical tradition that influenced Lewis and influenced Tolkien. We have a course called Coding with the Ancients. I mentioned it earlier, where we actually learn how to code from faculty members in our math department. And then we also have sessions where we reflect on the ethics of technology. We have a course called American Revolutions, which really capitalizes on our location here in Philadelphia. And it focuses on the American Revolution. And we have seminars at Valley Forge the Civil War, and we have seminars at Gettysburg, and the Civil Rights Movement. And we have seminars in the 7th Ward here in Philadelphia, where W.B. Du Bois wrote his great work, The Philadelphia Negro. So that's a fascinating course that last summer we ran with exclusively CLT test takers, and it was really marvelous. So we have the Lewis course, the Tolkien course, the math course, the American Revolutions course, and then we have a couple others that we rotate, one on Christian political thought and one on the Christian and philosophical moral tradition. So those are great. And those give you a taste of what we do here in the Honors College, and those give you college credit where we have students every year come together for those, and there's such camaraderie built because they kind of look at each other and say, oh, you love that too? I thought I was the only one. So those are super fun. Those take place in over 2.5, 3 weeks in July. We have an undergrad program. Let me tell you about that. Some of you might be looking for places to go to college. The Honors College program here at Eastern is an alternative general education program. Let me explain that. When you go to college, you have to take 39 to 40 hours in a smattering of different subjects, some history, some math, some science, some English, those kinds of things, before you go on to your major. The Honors College program at Eastern is a comprehensive, integrated, great books general education program. That means that all of your courses in that general education program are integrated with a select set of professors and with a small community of students, all of whom are taking the same courses at the same time. One of the values of that is that it then leaves you free to major in whatever you want. So you can major in cybersecurity, you can major in nursing, you can major in education, you can major in history and philosophy and English or business and leadership, those kinds of things, while also being rooted in this great books liberal arts education within the Honors College. Finally, the final program, if there are any teachers here, we have a master's program specifically for teachers in classical education. It's a Master of Arts in Classical Education or Classical Teaching. It's a 30 credit hour or 10 class program that meets on ground in the summer and online during the school year with all kinds of flexible modalities, a new phrase I know now, flexible modalities for teachers, for working teachers in classical schools. We started that after I got here in 2018, and we have all kinds of guest speakers and guest teachers in that, like Josh Gibbs and Robin Burlew and Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain. And this summer we have a brand new course called Classical Education and the Black Intellectual Tradition with a good friend of ours, Angel Adams-Parham, who has a new book coming out by almost that same title with Anika Prather, who's also a good friend of the college. So we have a class on classical education and disability, and then classes on history and pedagogy and theory of classical ed. So that's what we get up to in the Honors College, program for high school students in the summer, an undergrad program, and then a program for teachers in classical schools.
That sounds incredible. Wow. We have one more question. It looks like Skylar wants to know, do you have any summer opportunities that students already in college but interested in transferring can join to get to know Templeton?
Skylar, that's a good question. We don't actually have summer programs for undergraduate students. We do have numerous undergraduate students already starting their masters, and so they are enrolled in our MA program because we have a lot of undergraduate students who want to be classical school teachers, but they're not, and so they want to get a jump on that, and so they enroll, sometimes in one class in the MA program, or they audit a class in the MA program, both of which are entirely possible. Or Skylar, if you are interested in that and transferring, you should get in touch with me. My email address, I'm typing it in right now. There you go. You can shoot me an email and I can put you in touch with our recruiter in the Honors College, great woman named Abby Webb, who came through the Honors College as a philosophy major and has now come back and helping us recruit. So, and anybody else that wants to shoot me an email, if you have any questions about the Honors College, what we do, just shoot me an email. Or if you have a teacher that you think should enroll in our program, pass their name on to me and I'll come knocking on their door. Because we're putting together our cohort, not only for our undergrad program and not only for our high school program, but we're also putting together our new cohort of teachers in our MA program. So
get ready for everybody in this chat to email you. I'm sure there's a lot of parents nudging their kids right now, like, all right.
Awesome. Bring it. That's great. That's great.
All right. So I think we have come to the end of our time here. I just want to thank you, Dr. Williams, for such a wonderful presentation. And thank you to everybody for joining and for asking such great questions. I think Newman would be pleased with all of us. If you want to be notified about these conversations as we continue journeying through the author bank, you can get on our mailing list, and I will put that link right here in the chat. Let me send it. There we go. Yeah, we send out emails to notify you when these types of seminars are coming up. And these conversations, as you know, are a great way to get familiar with professors and learn about all different types of programs and colleges and different admissions processes. So our next JTAB is going to be April 14th at the same time, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about Jane Austen with Dr. Bethany Getz from the University of St. Catherine. And yeah, so that is all we have for this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for joining us.
Absolutely. Very happy to be here. Love talking about Newman any chance I get. And thank you, Chelsea, for hosting us all. Blessings, everybody. Have a great evening.
Have a great evening.